Hello, folks. Thank you for being on time, but let's wait another minute or two for other people to join.
Hi, just ask the other participants if they're seeing it. My Meet Echo window says the chat is offline. Are you also seeing that?
Yes.
I'll let the tools folks know. It shouldn't be like that.
All right, so let's get going. We only have 1 hour. A little bit of just a bare minimum of administration before we start. In case you didn't know, the IETF Note 12 applies to this meeting, and if you're not familiar with it, please look it up, IETF Note 12. And we cannot start unless we have a minute taker. So if anybody is willing to take it on, I would really appreciate it. You can either use your laptop and mail it to me, or you can use the Etherpad link that's on the meeting page in Data Tracker. But we're stuck. No taker, no meeting. So please. Russ, could I volunteer you?
Okay, I'll do it. This is Peter. That's okay, Russ. I'll get it.
Thanks a lot, Peter. All right, so now let's get going. I can share the slides, or if the editors prefer, you can do it, whatever.
You can, that's fine. There's not a ton of them.
Okay, so let's go.
All right. Sorry, somebody was asking me for the link to today's meeting, so I'm just sending that out real quick in the background here. There we go. Hopefully he gets that. All right. So hi, everybody. Welcome to the GNAP Interim meeting for October 2021. I'm Justin Richer, and my co-editors, Aaron and Fabienne, are here as well. Next slide, please. We've got a bunch of things that we want to touch on today. Because this is only an hour, we're not expecting to get super deep into things here, but the goal of this is to, as usual, raise the topics and sort of set the directions of at least what the editors have been thinking, and sort of the discussions that we've seen so far on a lot of these bits, and hopefully use that to kickstart and drive conversations on the mailing list and where appropriate in specific GitHub issue trackers. But before we get into those issues, we wanted to give the group an idea of the updates that we've had in the draft. They've been there for about a week and a half, I think we managed to get that draft out. And it consists of 3 major changes, new sections in the draft. But first, next slide, please. These are the changes. Sorry, I forgot our own slides. There's one sort of syntactic and semantic change that's been made in the draft in the current version -07. But the main changes that we're going to be going into are 3 new sections that are they're technically editorial, but they're all deeply important to sort of understanding and situating and using this draft. So next slide. First off, we're going to talk about the change to the user handle syntax. One of the things that originally came in, this goes back to the very first, to the 0.0 version of GNAP, was that there was this special field called user handle that could come back in the response, and then the client instance was able to use that to say, hey, this represents the same user. As best as I can tell, I'm talking to you on behalf of the same end user that I was talking to previously. With all of the extensive work that's been put into the subject identifiers, largely that was Fabien's doing, so thank you very much for all that. But with that extensive work, we took a step back and realized that we kind of didn't need this extra sort of special field anymore. We had all of the pieces to reuse the different bits that were already in the protocol and get the same results. So now a client instance is allowed to send an opaque subject identifier as effectively a shortcut for saying this is the same user. Now, the client instance has always been able to send back that identifier. That's always kind of been a feature, but now that we have this sort of specific shortcut for this sort of known use case that's based on the user managed access persisted claims token construct, then we've now got this built in, but in such a way that it reuses the existing machinery instead of being its own little special thing on the side. Simplifies the protocol, uses exercises stuff that we already have. But that's the only syntactical change. Next slide, please. The biggest changes in the document are the trust relationships, security and privacy considerations. So Fabienne, do you actually want to take a moment to talk about the trust relationship section?
Hello, everyone. Well, sorry, I'm on the move, so you might hear a few noises in the background. Sorry about that. Yes, the most important thing about trust relationships is that we actually wanted to do that for a long time. And it doesn't change anything in terms of requirements, but it does change the description of what we do and the intent that we bring to it. And the way we've tried to approach this is not to import any security or privacy issues into that section, and to bring that as one of the first section in section 1.4. And we are actually using a definition that comes from iTheory, so that's a proposal. And then we actually identified the different parts of the protocols, the actors in the protocols that need to discuss and trust each other's. And we do that based on description, based on promises and trust. So that's the general idea. The text is very short, but it's really an initial draft to actually clarify out the different ideas. So that's it, I think, for the section, except if you've got some questions.
All right, thanks. And I just also want to add that a lot of this is based on some very, very lengthy conversations that the working group had that teased out a lot of these relationships. Going back, you can see things that talk about, AS-RS relationship and client AS relationship and how those are different from each other and how the expectations are different from each other. This is a way to kind of formalize that a bit and make it more more directly specified. And speaking in terms of those relationships, I think is a very powerful way to do that. So
yeah, something just to add on that, we can actually formalize these types of relationships because you've got a mathematical model behind that. So if people want to have a look at that, it's an open door to actually formalize the trust relationships in very, well, Daniel Fed type of situation, I would say.
Right. So any questions on this before we move forward?
So, Denis?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Well, I looked at that section and made 4 comments on the issue 306. And basically, the section called trust relationship does not define trust relationship in fact. Trust has been defined by ISO a long time ago in the last century. When you want to express a trust relationship, you say entity is said to trust entity Y for a set of activities. A does not trust B. It trusts B for something. And currently, the draft 7 uses the concept of a promise, which is basically left undefined in the draft. And it is not because A makes a promise to B that B should necessarily trust that promise. So in my opinion, the promise theory is not adequate to be used. Now, if you look at the 6 defined so-called trust relationships, they are about the end user versus the arrow, which is a specific case only when the end user is also the arrow. You have the end user client and client AS, which do not define any kind of trust relationship in the text. RS arrow does not define any kind of relationship either, and RS arrow neither. So these 6 pseudo relationships do not allow to define a trust model. There are holes in the model which do not allow to demonstrate that the current protocols are secure. And the most important comment I have is the following. There is a sentence which says, the AS promises to issue valid access token to legitimate client request, which leaves the relationship between the end user and the authorization server undefined, and this is a major security hole.
Okay, let me answer.
In addition to this general comment, the current draft implicitly supports only capabilities. And when you want to define trust relationship, you cannot define the same trust relationship whether you support a capability-based access control model or an attribute-based access control model. Now, I believe that both models should be supported and they can be simultaneously supported. I have issued a draft on the mailing list, and that draft is defining some trust relationship common to the 2 models and then makes a clear extension between the trust relationships that apply to each access control model. And I believe that we should support both. A key question is whether draft 7 will evolve to take into consideration attribute-based access control. This has strong privacy and security implications and mandates the support of additional core protocols, in particular to support the end user choice and consent. That's it.
Thank you. Justin or Fabienne, would you like to respond at least to the first part of Denis' question?
Go ahead, Fabian.
Well, first of all, it's really an initial draft, so there might be some relationships which are missing, and it's true that there's at least one that's missing, which is a relationship between the client and between the end user and the authorization server. The reason why I didn't put that into the text is because it's actually quite a complex relationship, because in practice you're going to
I think we lost Fabian's audio there. He did say he was mobile today. So if I can summarize a little bit of what's already been discussed in the GitHub issue, one of the biggest things about this model is that it brings in context in a very important way. Yes, the editors are very aware of the ISO trust relationship model. That is far from the only model of formal model of trust relationships that there are in the world. This one brings a lot of really important context to each of the relationships, including the purpose that was brought up before. It is not missing. It's actually integral to what is being discussed here. Yes, we know it's not completely complete yet, but the spec is also not done. So more feedback, more input would be absolutely appreciated on this, but it is deeply misleading and disingenuous to say that this is not a trust model simply because it is not following one specific trust model out there. I think I see Adrian.
Okay, thank you. Adrian, please go ahead.
Yes. Another question related to this agenda item is whether it would be appropriate to consider zero trust architecture, at least as it is defined by NIST, for lack of a more formal definition, and discuss that explicitly in the document. Just because I, for one, am not schooled in these formal modeling exercises, but I think I and many of our audience would be interested in the applicability of GNAP to zero trust architecture. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. I'll take that one.
By zero trust, I, for one, mostly know it as a buzzword than as a well-defined construct. So.
Yeah, that's exactly a key part of the problem. When you say trust and trust relationship, it's going to fall out in a lot of different ways. Zero trust architectures are absolutely brilliant. I've done a lot of work both with NIST and with other groups on their application. That's not what we're really talking about here. A lot of times zero trust means that you don't pre-establish trust based on an authority. That's kind of a general theme with zero trust systems. So it's not based on just pre-registering all participants and knowing identities of all participants ahead of time. It's building trust based on what can be sort of preserved and presented throughout. So that's not exactly the same kind of thing that we're talking about here. We're talking about a different aspect of trust. And so a lot of the concepts in zero trust are really around how these relationships get formed, whereas the trust relationship that's currently discussed in section 1.4 is about what that relationship means once it has been formed, if that distinction makes sense. And so I think it does make sense to talk about how these get formed, which is why we have the model of client instances identified and proved by keys, for example, and why we split the AS-RS trust relationship and how that's mechanically built into its own spec, because that is a very, very distinct part of the system. So it's related, but largely orthogonal to this, and a lot of that comes with just the way overloaded term trust. Leif and I could tell you some stories about when we were writing the Vectors of Trust RFC over a number of years about running into similar things.
Justin, just to close this out, I am not at all interested in arguing the point you just made. What I'm saying is that Zero Trust architecture basically introduces specific concepts: separation of concerns, accountability of individuals, least privilege authorizations, and audit capabilities. Each one of these four things, regardless of what we choose to point to as a definition, is relevant to the protocol for being either in scope or out of scope. And rather than, so I don't see that as being squishy at all. You could ignore the term Zero Trust architecture and simply list those four things relative to GNAP in any informative section, and it would serve the same purpose. So I'm just suggesting that rather than just privacy, security, and trust considerations, we might want to somehow address these four things, either under the rubric of Zero Trust or not, depending on how the experts believe that I'm overstating or oversimplifying the issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. I would encourage you to actually file that as an issue with those specific 4 points against the core document. I'm all for formalizing this stuff. Everything that you've said, like formalizing these relationships, is going to allow us to talk about things in that type of way, if that's something that's useful for the group overall. And as you know, Yarn especially has been always about formalizing the security and trust analysis of this, and so having those as sort of primitives for that analysis, I think would be helpful. So yeah, please do that. We do have a lot more slides to get through when we're on number 5, so I'm going to recommend we move forward, but I see Denis is back in the queue.
Justin, would you be able to respond to the problem I raised about capability versus attribute-based access control?
Sure, I will happily respond to it the same way that I've responded to it before, that both capability and RBAC and ABAC and all of that are already supported inside GNAP, and GNAP does not take a hard stance on any of those, that you can do any of those, and I've showed you how, and we've written it down several times, so that's still my response.
Well, it's not possible today, because
yes,
as
it is.
soon as
Next slide, please.
Attribute-based access control, the user
you can have attributes. Denis, you can have attributes for the client, for the resource owner, for the end user, for the authorization server, for the resources being protected, for the subject information being returned. All of those attributes can go into the formal decision, whether they are represented inside the access token or in the data model that the access token is used to look up. GNAP does not take a hard stance on that. That's why that's been pulled into the RS document. All of that can be done today. It can even be done in an OAuth-based system just as easily, and GNAP is taking a very similar model to that. So I'm sorry, but your stance does not match reality.
I simply disagree with you.
I know. So, yeah. All right. Next slide. Let's see here. The security consideration section, as this is at its core a security document, we expected this to be fairly long. This is our first slice at it. Right now, it's got 21 subsections, and it's gonna have more probably. We tried to take a very, very wide swath at this. And a lot of this comes down to what a lot of us in this group would consider to be common sense. Like, yes, you really do have to use TLS. And yes, if somebody steals a bearer token, they can use the bearer token. But we really do have to spell all of these things out. And I would encourage group members to please read through those. We know that there probably are holes. We don't know exactly what the holes are, which is what makes them holes. You know, figure out what we've missed. One of the next steps that the editors have is to actually sort of, you know, group these so that reading them makes a little bit more sense, that we have, you know, similar issues grouped together and can kind of tell a better story, so that an implementer reading through this document can actually end up doing the right thing. A lot of these sections, though, I want to point out, are all about talking about the trade-offs in the different spaces. So, for example, bearer tokens. You can use bearer tokens, but you are going to have to need to know all of the considerations for if you use bearer tokens. GNAP by default doesn't use bearer tokens. By default, they're bound to the client instance's key, but you can make that special flag to say, no, really, I want a bearer token when I'm talking to this resource. And but when you do that, you need to know what the trade-offs are. And that's what this section is all about. This section does not add additional requirements to anything, but it's designed to sort of tell people what the decision space is, and hopefully narrow the decision space for people who are trying to do the right thing. There are going to also be cases, and this is another thing that the editors are kind of asking the group to help us make sure we get all these. There are going to be cases where something is stated in a security consideration that isn't yet tied back to an actual normative requirement earlier in the document. We need to make sure that we have all of those requirements stated out in normative language, so that it's not just a security consideration that says, hey, this would be a good idea. We need to have other companion text that says this is required. For more details, go see the security considerations, which tell you why, but you still have to do it. So I didn't want to go in, you know, it's a lot of text. I didn't want to go into detail about everything here, but I will pause for any questions or concerns or considerations for this piece.
Okay.
Looks like
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, since the structure of an access token is left undefined, this is currently insufficient to say that it's impossible, that this is sufficient to say that it is impossible for an RS to verify that an access token is valid. The document is currently still a framework and is unable to define secure interval protocol. When you have a protocol, you need to know exactly how to verify what you receive. And it's not possible unless the structure of the access token is defined. Now,
in meetings and on GitHub, and raising them one more time is not going to do anybody any good. You have published your thoughts as a separate internet draft. I do request that you bring it up on the list again and have this discussion about your point of view on the list. Raising these points on this meeting is just not useful for the rest of us. I'm sorry.
Okay, I have additional comments. In draft 7, the model is considering client instances. However, in an access token, the RS should place rights or attributes that relate to an end user, and not to a client instance. How this can be done is currently left undefined in draft 7. In my draft that I publish, I consider that the authentication of an end user by an authorization server is a key feature, and I do not need to consider client instances nor client instance keys. This is a fundamental difference. Now, my last point, which relates to that, is that draft 7 consider the binding of an access token to a key by a client instance in its request. However, this does not prevent an access token to be forwarded to another client instance and to be successfully used by it. In my draft, I consider a fully different method which prevents such a collusion attack. This is accomplished by a field called a binding user identifier that allows the IRS to verify that the access token is associated with the right short-term or long-term user account. This is explained in section 181.
Okay, to respond to that just very quickly, there are many very well understood use cases where there is no end user. The token model, it has long been understood and used to represent the tuple of the resource owner, implied or entity or otherwise, the client making the request, the authorization server or authorization entity generating this and the context that it has there, and the rights and therefore resources being granted as part of that. So the statement that tokens should not ever be bound to the client is deeply problematic. And but if you really want that, then you can use bearer tokens as long as you follow all of the considerations about bearer tokens. Then you have a token that is not bound to any specific client for presentation purposes. Although the value of that is very well understood and one of the driving reasons for doing GNAP. As far as the rest of that, you know, the relationship between the AS and the RS is very important, but it is also very separate from the relationship between the client and the AS and the client and the RS. This is a large part of why formalizing out the trust relationships, why we underwent that exercise, why that is a really important thing to be able to lay out. And I actually suggest that we move on because none of this has any bearing on the security considerations discussion, which is what I was asking for feedback on.
You recommend to use bearer token if I don't like bound token. I'm saying that both are insecure. One,
okay, and
if you have bearer token are very easy to forward to another client. When you have bound token, it's a little bit more difficult, but it's still easy to be done if the client is willing to collude with the other user. So
Denis,
what I am proposing is
Denis,
basically.
Denis, I am sorry to interrupt, but we understand what you are proposing, and you have yet to explain sufficiently how putting a user identifier inside the token means that I can't forward it. Because as far as the RS is concerned, if I send my token to Yaron with all of my keys, then Yaron can use it and the RS thinks that it's me because the token says that it's me and all of the proof says that. That's the entire point of a technological abstraction.
Well, I explained that to Aaron, and I believe he finally answered my position. Now, if you don't answer, please raise an issue and I will answer. The answer is very easy for me.
And came to the same conclusion, which is that no, this does not actually add anything new. And this has already been discussed on GitHub. So all I'm hearing is the same arguments that are in that thread. And this also does not seem relevant to the current topic.
Well, I believe you don't see the problem because you don't think about attribute-based access control and you think about rights only.
That is deeply incorrect. I understand exactly what you're saying, and that is actually the topic of several parts of the security considerations. If you give someone else your keys, they act as you. That's the basis of your collusion attack.
No, my key is not the key from the client. That's the key for the user. So a user will not give its key, its password or whatever authentication means away. That's important. And what is important is to make sure that sorry, can I continue? The draft does not make clear that user authentication is needed. And I gave you some argument coming from the European Union, where we need to have multi-factor authentication and at least two-factor authentication to be supported. So it's fundamental to say how the end user is authenticated. And the draft is mute about that.
Correct. The draft is mute about that because it is so important that GNAP should not take a hard technological stance on that. It is deeply contextual.
We don't understand each other clearly on that point.
I understand you very well, actually. I just very deeply disagree and have come to very different conclusions. But I honestly believe that I understand you.
Well, today in Europe, if you want to authenticate to a bank, the end user, I mean, not the client, needs to have a strong authentication, two-factor and maybe more.
Correct. And in the GNAP protocol, when the client and the AS say that the user needs to get involved, then the user does get involved and the AS requires multiple factor authentication, which is a separate orthogonal issue to the issuance of the credential that results from that to allow the software to act on the user's behalf. This is fundamentally a delegation protocol, not an authentication protocol.
Clearly, when the TLS channel is being constructed between the client and the AS, the first thing to be done is end user authentication.
Denis, I'm sorry I asked Roman to speak up.
Thanks. So I think we need to table this discussion that we're having here. We have only an hour, and we had attempted to do a breadth first kind of walk through all of the material. We're clearly rat holing kind of down a particular kind of issue that will prevent us to getting kind of through that. So Denis and Justin, I would ask if we can kind of table this discussion and honestly just keep moving through the material we have. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next slide, please. Aaron, do you want to jump on for this real quick, the privacy considerations?
Sure, I can talk through these. So there is a brand new privacy considerations section in the document, and the approach we took here was to go through the points brought up in RFC 6793, which is a framework for making privacy considerations for specs, and talk about the ones that are relevant to this spec. As I was reading through that, turns out some of them don't really apply in this kind of framework because they have more to do with other types of specs, like HTTP just it has a lot of different considerations compared to a delegated authorization protocol. But I did pick out the topics that I felt were relevant to GNAP, and then went through each of those points and addressed each of the points. So it looks like we lost Yaron. Or is that just me?
I don't see him either. And we lost the slides.
We lost him, but he looks like he's back. And we lost the slides.
All right.
Well, I'll just I can just keep going.
Yeah, just keep going. I'm gonna see if I can share slides in the meantime. So go.
Okay, great. So the approach here was not to say that GNAP is the most private thing ever and has solved all problems ever. The point of the privacy considerations spec or section is to talk about how GNAP relates to each of the privacy considerations. So, for example, the surveillance section talks about where is surveillance possible under the current model and by who, and for example, surveillance by the client talks about the fact that obviously the client is the thing that the user is trying to use, so that's not surveillance. Surveillance is the unintentional monitoring of activity. But if the client is built up as multiple distinct pieces of software where, as far as its role in GNAP, it is considered the quote unquote client, but it's actually a mobile app with a logging service in the cloud that's reporting usage data, et cetera, that is where that surveillance may be possible by the client that may be unexpected by the user. I see Yaron has his hand raised. I will pause.
Yaron, go ahead if you're able to connect. I'm sharing the slides again, but we can see you back here at least.
I apologize. I have two questions. One, going back to the trust relationship section, and my question is whether we know that the formalism that we have selected is actually being used by the teams and by the tools that are doing formal verification of such protocols. And that may be a question to Fabienne.
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's an open discussion. Actually, we've got some discussions with the OAuth security workshop that's ongoing. So I actually plan to work on that. But the framework actually comes from Mark Burgess from CF Engine, so it's been used in the IT quite extensively. The fact is, it actually goes much further in the definition of trust, as I said before, and especially trust is not only defined as something you rely on, and you can actually put some evaluations in your framework. So it's something that you can actually implement, but yeah, it needs some further work. But compared to existing trust frameworks, it can be something that you can evaluate, at least.
Okay, thank you. And my second question is, do the editors think there's value in separate security and or privacy considerations for the RS draft? Or are these meant for both of them?
I'll just jump in and say that from my perspective, absolutely. There are definitely different considerations. The editors took the approach of focusing on filling these out for the core document first. There may be some that move to the RS draft. There will probably be others that are in the RS draft. The core will probably, this is just conjecture on my part, but the core, I believe, will probably end up being more comprehensive, just sort of as its nature as the core document. But I can absolutely see these things showing up in the RS draft.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you.
From a personal perspective, I would like to avoid the separate security document approach that the OAuth working group took with OAuth 2, if we can, at least out the gate.
All right. Denis?
Yes, thank you. First of all, on the slide, you can see the RFC number is incorrect. It's RFC 6973. But this is a minor detail.
Thank you for the typo.
The current document says it is modeled according to the privacy consideration for Internet Protocol. Unfortunately, this is not the case, because this document includes section 7 called guidelines, which is raising a large number of questions, and most of these questions has been left unanswered. So I cannot consider that this guideline has been followed. You can see the details about which one have been unanswered under the issue 307. Now, there is an interesting sentence, which is in section 13.3 called intrusion, which deals with denial of service, which basically has nothing to do with privacy. However, that sentence is interesting. It says, the format and contents of subject identifier are intentionally not defined by GNAP. Well, in my opinion, this leaves the door wide open on how a RS can verify that an access token is associated or not with the right short-term or long-term RS user account. In the draft,
this is in the RS draft. I'm really not appreciating of repeating the same arguments over and over again. It does not feel constructive. And yes, this core document says it is not defined by GNAP, because that is true. And that is what the separate RS draft starts to get into, is those particular kinds of issues. Also, your point about the intrusion not being in the privacy consideration section, it is part of the, thanks for catching the typo, RFC 6973. It is one of the items in that list, and it is defined as the ability of various parties to send unsolicited messages to unrelated parties, which is the reason I put it into this section. So I'm not sure I understand your argument here, but also it feels like if you do have a particular concern, it'd be more useful to bring this up on the mailing list to avoid spending the rest of our time talking about this here.
Agreed.
And I agree. Justin, please go ahead.
Yep. So unfortunately, we only have a few minutes to go through the open issues. I will do my best to talk quickly through these pieces before we get to the end here. So first, issue 299. I believe Yarn raised it, but he's commented on it at the very least. The overall question of how symmetric cryptography either fits or doesn't fit inside of GNAP. And this is something that we just, as a group, need to decide where we land on this. There are very clear reasons to disallow this, and most specific is that it's an inherent weakness of symmetric crypto that the keys need to be in the hands of both parties in order to both verify and create the associated signatures. And there are alternatives out there. That said, GNAP does explicitly disallow key distribution for symmetric keys in all of the places that we allow for key distribution within the protocol. And there are alternatives in technologies that can be applied for using symmetric cryptography in a safe and reasonable way. This is a technical argument that needs to happen. Please check issue 299, weigh in on that. There was a really interesting use case brought to us by the Solid working group, or a member of the Solid community, rather. And the idea here is that the client has access to a set of provable claims about the end user that's currently using the client. And it can get those to the AS and for the purposes of getting an access token for a protected RS downstream. And this brings up a bunch of really interesting questions about how something like this fits in with GNAP. One of the key things that GNAP's architecture does is that it backs away from the OAuth assumption that the end user is the resource owner and they always interact with the AS probably through a web page unless something else and something weird is happening, at least from the OAuth perspective. But we need to be, I think we can do a good job of being clearer about how those bits fit together, because if we look at, I put together a couple of very simple sequence diagrams about how this might go about. In this case, there is what the writer of the use case called the end user extension server, the EUXS, which has these claims about the end user. In this sequence, if you read through, you'll see that it's actually the client that goes and gets those from the EUXS and then presents them back to the authorization server on behalf of the end user. This kind of fits what had been talked about previously with the SSI digital wallet and the client saying like, hey, I know how to talk to a wallet and I can get you some wallet stuff. Alternatively would be for the AS to talk to the end user extension server and get the user to interact there directly, and then get those sent back to the authorization server without actually talking through the client instance. Both of these are a different way of proxying sort of this rights information. And I think it's kind of an open question, like which makes more sense inside GNAP, or are there other ways to layer this that make even more sense? So in case one, we presume that the client can do a lot of work. It can go off to this other server and get the stuff and bring it back. It also allows the client to kind of preload some of this stuff and just say, hey, here's what I know about the current user. What can you do with it? In case two, the AS sort of turns into its own client to this extension server, but it doesn't normally interact, or in this case, it doesn't interact with the end user directly. And when writing out the sequence diagram for case two, I realized it looked familiar because it's very similar to the mix-up attack that we just put in a patch against. So, you know, does this make sense to allow in the right limited circumstances? This also brings up and gets us into another big question of differentiating between the end user and the resource owner in GNAP. These are two different roles. The end user talks to the client software. The resource owner controls access to the protected resource via the authorization server. And so those are two different relationships in our key diagram. In OAuth, we assume that they're the same person. In some weird extensions, they can possibly not be. But in GNAP, it's pretty clear how we can kind of connect those together for when we're talking to the resource server, but things get murky when we start talking about returning subject information directly back to the client. If the RO is not the same as the end user and I'm returning subject information about the resource owner, is that actually a use case, or is that a privacy violation? We need to figure out exactly how GNAP needs to draw these lines. And throughout the document, the editors know we need to be very clear, or we need to be clearer in all of the places where we're talking specifically about end user versus resource owner and what each piece represents. We've tried to be so far. We need to be better. And if people can take a read through the document, specifically the pieces that are talking about subject information, we need to make sure that we're not writing out any use cases or introducing security holes in how we're describing this. Do we want to take the cue, or do we want to get through the end? We only have a couple minutes. Chairs?
Everyone's online.
Please continue with the next slide.
All right, thank you. All right, next up is a technical bit that got brought up a while ago, and that is defining the resource access request, the access type field in a generic HTTP kind of way. And this is, honestly, it's a really clever hack. I think it's a really neat idea. The idea here being that I don't actually know much about the kind of API that I'm calling. I just know that it's HTTP. And so here are the HTTP verbs, and here are the URLs that I'm doing, and here are the MIME types that I'm using. It's a very HTTP driven kind of thing. which could make sense for a lot of really dynamically driven types of protocols and ecosystems, and stuff that doesn't need sort of a higher order of semantics beyond what HTTP already provides. So the question here is, should we do this? And if we do it, is there then an assumption or a requirement for RSs to understand what these types mean, or for an AS to be able to map that to the RSs that it's protecting? And if we do this, do we do it inside GNAP Core, inside GNAP RS, inside some other extension, or in some other document? And to point out, I want to be clear here that with the way that these things are structured, this could be a document just completely outside of the IETF if there was no appetite within the IETF to define this. Because the type field is recommended to be a namespace collision resistant URL. That URL could be hosted anywhere and house this document that says, here's how to do generic HTTP stuff and what that kind of means. But the relationship of this work to GNAP Core and to this working group is not yet decided. So, the editors would like to know, is this something that people have an appetite for? What would we like to do with this bit, with this proposal? And that was it for the technical topics. My last question is, IETF 112 is coming up. It's going to be virtual again, so we'll all be sitting here in Meet Echo. So what are sort of the key things that we can focus on going up to that? The editors are once again going to have at least one more revision of the core draft and hopefully the RS draft by then as well. And I'm not taking a shopping list right now, but I am going to ask people to continue to raise topics on the list for sort of next generation stuff, or next meeting stuff. Sorry, not next generation quite yet. And that's the whole presentation. So, Darren.
Thank you very much. Adrian, did you want to raise an issue?
We'll deal with it like Justin said. Thank you.
Given the timing, I think he was asking, he was going to bring up a topic for 112. And yeah, I think those should go to the list. Thank you.
Denis?
Justin, you raised a question about subject information. Well, many months ago, I made a proposal, maybe as you should reconsider. In order to be clear, I call that end user information. So it's information on the end user necessarily.
Yep, I recall that proposal. Thank you.
Okay, and for now, my assumption is we will iterate on the security and privacy sections for or until IETF 112. There's probably still quite a bit to do there.
Makes sense.
Adrian?
Just to note that next week is IIW, and I would like to make sure that GNAP is well represented. If anybody wants to coordinate with me, I don't feel like I can represent GNAP in many respects. Please do get in touch with me. Thank you.
All right, so with that, we're almost at time, 1 minute before. I'd like to thank the editors again for the great job they're doing on the document and for preparing this meeting. And hope to see you all at the next virtual IETF meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, chairs, and thank you, everyone.